Do you see how brutal this setup is? He has the empire, the money, the political marriage, the perfect fiance, the whole room bending around his power. And yet the one woman who ever loved him without fear is standing in the back wearing a server's uniform, pregnant, exhausted, and completely alone. That is the real punch to the chest. Not the betrayal, not even the secret child. It is the fact that while he was reclaiming his throne, she was surviving in silence. This is the kind of plot twist that does not just ruin a wedding. It exposes that everybody in the story was losing long before the truth came out.
The Meridian Grand functions as a gilded enclosure this evening. A palpable tension and unvoiced state of conflict permeates the atmosphere of shimmering crystal and reflective marble. The city's elite maneuver through a landscape of opulent botanical displays and tables cloaked in silver. The melody of smooth jazz provides a thin acoustic facade of tranquility, complemented by the flow of expensive spirits. However, the event is far from a simple celebration. Sentinels in dark attire patrolled the periphery, their gazes hypervigilant, the hardware concealed by their tailoring serving as a tacit threat. Each visual exchange constitutes an act of observation, each physical contact a ritualized pact rather than a casual salutation. The gathering commemorates the betrothal of Cale Thornton, ruler of the East Coast's illicit enterprise. At 37, he engineered a covert network into a corporate leviathan stretching from New York to Miami. This event is designed for dynastic consolidation, uniting him with Priscilla Hargrove, the sole heir of Southern Syndicate leader Raymond Hargrove. This represents a strategic merger of America's two dominant criminal organizations. A transaction devoid of sentiment, witnessed by a conclave of individuals who operate in shadow. The assembly congregates in the central hall, a space where electronic devices are forbidden, making every human eye a recording instrument for subtle behavioral cues. It is an orchestrated performance of feigned affability and empty acclamations, a pretense Cale consciously disengages from, his beverage untouched for the last hour. His formidable presence creates an observable zone of calm. His chiseled features betray no emotional state. Yet the intimidating gray eyes that dominate his sphere of influence are completely devoid of affect. The subject is psychically absent from his own coronation. Priscilla is positioned beside him, a visual marvel in a scarlet gown laden with a fortune in gems. Her smile is a meticulously rehearsed expression, her aesthetic flawless, her hand gripping Cale's arm with proprietary force, a nonverbal declaration of ownership. She inclines toward him, her smile unwavering, murmuring, "One might mistake this for a funeral, not a celebration of your betrothal." A fleeting, frigid smile touches Cale's lips. "I am fine." The statement is delivered with a clipped, glacial tone, a coldness she seems either unable to perceive or chooses to disregard. She appears to opt for deliberate inattention, redirecting her impeccable smile toward another target. Poised and majestic, she embodies the ideal matriarch for the Thornton dynasty, the consort deemed appropriate for a man of his standing. Yet Cale's internal assessment is clear. The woman beside him is a living embodiment of a contractual agreement. His gaze sweeps the room, cataloging the sycophants and dependents, all magnetized by his authority, desperate for his validation or terrified of his wrath. The entire gathering desires a stake in his dominion. By rights, this event should mark the apex of his achievement. 2 years ago, however, his existence was the antithesis of this display, a period of perpetual threat defined by the one individual who perceived the human beneath the pathological facade, a recurring, intrusive memory he actively suppresses. Memory, however, functions as a predator, striking in moments of low stimulus. Cale's eyes open abruptly. The grand ballroom perceptually constricts around him. He proceeds toward this balcony, with his subordinate Sterling trailing 3 paces behind, a perpetual extension of his presence. He emerges into the abiding Manhattan atmosphere, the urban expanse below resembling a constellation of subjugated lights. After a brief pause for internal processing, he pivots to return to the high-stress social environment. Traversing the corridor, he observes a service entrance partially ajar. An auditory cue, the clash of dinnerware, then a voice slicing through the ambient noise. "I can handle that tray. You should rest," induces an immediate state of motor paralysis in the subject. His perceptual field contracts sharply. All other sensory input, music, speech, the resonance of glass, ceases to register. His entire consciousness is consumed by that voice, gentle yet showing signs of strain, the same vocal signature that served as his anchor during the collapse of his previous life. "We will get through this." The memory retrieval is instantaneous and jarring. He experiences a severe cardiac reaction, a powerful arrhythmia followed by a perceived pause. Compelled, he approaches the door, peering through the opening at a chaotic kitchen, a vortex of activity, and positioned at its center, he locates the source: Meadow. The subject is hoisting a substantial tray of flutes, attired in a standard staff uniform. Her frame is noticeably leaner, her features marked by extreme fatigue. The emotional warmth previously observed in her expression is now obscured by physical and mental exhaustion. The intervening years have evidently taken a toll. Yet her identity is confirmed by idiosyncratic gestures: the specific cant of her head, the weary smile directed at a coworker. This is the same individual who once perceived the man behind the pathology within a small Brooklyn bookshop. She then turns, and Kale's carefully constructed reality fractures. Her abdomen is distended, a clear and advanced state of pregnancy. Microfractures spiderweb across the glass in his hand, the sound masked by the somatic sensation of blood pulsing in his ears. He is psychologically unmoored. His awareness of the external environment, the event, the city, the world, disintegrates. All that remains is the powerful impact of his own heartbeat. The subject, Meadow, had vanished from his life 9 months prior without explanation or trace, a complete and sudden absence. She has now reappeared, working as a server at his betrothal ceremony, nearing full-term pregnancy. 9 months. The number registers with the force of a physical blow. A 9-month absence coinciding with a 9-month gestation period. The chronological correlation presents a stark, inescapable, and horrific conclusion. His cognitive processes fragment. He rapidly entertains and discards alternate hypotheses. Another partner, a spouse. Paternity is questioned. Then one overriding conviction emerges from the chaos, supplanting all others. The child is his. Kale remains immobilized, observing Meadow, who is oblivious to the presence of a figure from her past. Sterling halts behind him, his gaze following Kale's line of sight. He comprehends. He is aware. A secret maintained for 5 months has been exposed by a random, brutal circumstance. Kale pivots, his gray eyes ignited with an intensity that transcends mere rage. Sterling maintains his position, bracing for the inevitable outburst. He foresees the inquiry and understands its answer will destabilize the foundation of their shared reality. In this corridor, the past has collided violently with the present. A deception sustained for 5 months is now nullified, and a cataclysmic event is imminent within the Thornton organization. Kale's subsequent behavior will irrevocably alter the life trajectories of all his associates. The atmosphere during his confrontation with Sterling is thick with consequence. The subject's gaze is no longer cold. It is incandescent, driven by a primal emotion that predates simple anger, an expression Sterling has not witnessed in 12 years. There is no overt aggression, merely a single statement delivered in a low tone with immense latent force. Every syllable carries the weight of a verdict. "She is present." The sentence is an assertion, not a question. Sterling exhibits no startled response. He avoids prevarication or excuse, offering a single deliberate nod, a silent admission. The hallway is filled with an oppressive quiet. Beyond the door, the celebration proceeds, oblivious, a parallel reality of sound and merriment. Within the corridor, however, the psychic pressure is suffocating. Cale's focus remains fixed upon Sterling, intense and unwavering. For 12 years, Sterling had been a constant variable through periods of strife and exile in an environment where a glance could be fatal. A dozen years of allegiance instantly invalidated. The primary interrogatives burn within Cale's mind. For what duration? And the most corrosive query, for what reason? The impulse to demand if Sterling was aware of the child, if he knew the identity of the father, is a visceral torment. To ask if Meadow was conscious of his nocturnal pacing in a vacant home, plagued by the possibility of her death. He feels an overwhelming need to vocalize these questions, yet he cannot permit an emotional outburst in this location. The country's most powerful figures are in close proximity. Employing immense self-control, Cale suppresses the volcanic rage of betrayal. His vocal tone, when he finally issues a command, is preternaturally composed. Isolate the service corridor. Total containment. No ingress or egress. Sterling provides another sharp nod, displaying immediate compliance. He understands that the consequences are merely delayed. His function now is to execute the directive and survive the fallout. Cale pivots and walks away. Every footfall up the polished stone was a demonstration of absolute self-mastery, concealing the seismic event that had just fractured his psyche. He re-entered the ballroom, a sensory onslaught of light and sound. Hundreds of unaware attendees offered smiles. Priscilla was positioned by the stage, engaging the spouse of a senator. Upon visual contact, her posture shifted, presenting a practiced, welcoming expression as she extended her hand. The subject, Cale, completed the tableau, his hand on her back creating the codified image of a power couple. He vocalized a toast, his modulation and smile executed with precision. The subject's performance was near perfect, marred only by a notable lack of effective expression in his gaze. This void was perceptible only to an observer familiar with his psychological baseline. Priscilla demonstrated either a failure to perceive this disconnect or a willful ignorance maintaining her role in the social contract. Cale, however, had already dissociated from the event. His body occupied space in the luminous ballroom, holding a whiskey tumbler beside his intended spouse. His consciousness, however, remained fixed on a service corridor, on a small woman in a low-cost uniform, her hands calloused, her body carrying a child he believed to be his. He raised the glass to his mouth. On this occasion, he consumed the drink. He registered the caustic trail of the whiskey, a futile attempt to cauterize his internal decay. No intoxicant possessed sufficient strength. Nothing could erase the visual imprint of Meadow, gaunt, exhausted, and gestating a life he had unknowingly co-created. 8 months. The revised calculation was a toxic knot in his gut. The past intruded, transporting him to an afternoon in Brooklyn. He was reliving the moment inside the bookstore, the sound of her laughter as he mishandled a pile of books just prior to the event that destroyed their shared reality. 2 years prior, the subject, Cale Thornton, entered a small bookshop on a quiet Brooklyn street on a clear October day. The chime of a bell signaled his entry into an environment scented with aged paper and pine, where soft light illuminated floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. In this new environment, the external architecture of his power, surveillance systems, armed personnel, displays of submission was absent. The stimuli were reduced to books, silence, and a female clerk engaged in reading. The subject's objective was a 1925 first edition of The Great Gatsby, a private, compartmentalized fixation. A significant paradox is noted. The subject, a high-level predator, exhibited a strong attachment to literature. This psychological vulnerability, if discovered by rivals, would be exploited. Within this sanctuary, however, his status was neutralized. An auditory cue, a bell, prompted the clerk to look up. Her hair, light brown, framed her shoulders. Her expression registered as inquisitive and non-threatening. She wore a cream-colored sweater and displayed a genuine smile, a stimulus that momentarily disrupted the subject's rumination on a recent violent operation. "Good afternoon," she initiated. "Are you looking for a particular title or just browsing?" The subject paused, assessing her, before stating his objective in a low tone. "A first edition Fitzgerald." She gestured left. "The rare books are over there." His initial search of the indicated area proved fruitless. He proceeded to the adjacent sections. From the desk, her voice, exhibiting mild amusement, corrected him. "That's the romance aisle. You're in the wrong place, unless you want the special Gatsby he wrote for his mistress." The subject pivoted slowly, establishing direct eye contact. It is unclear when the subject was last exposed to teasing, a form of social interaction, absent from his typical environment of fear and sycophancy. No individual in his operational sphere engaged him with such candor, as if he were an ordinary man. This woman, however, did. Instead of a hostile response, the subject displayed the faint, muscular activation of a smile. In a significant deviation from protocol, she left her post, guided him to the correct location, and presented a paper-wrapped volume. Not a first, but a 1934 copy in mint condition. He accepted the object, his handling of the pages showing a marked reverence. The 90-year-old paper and ink were a tangible link to his fixation. She observed this behavior, asking, "Are you a passionate reader?" He responded, "When time permits." "What's your favorite book?" The inquiry's personal nature was a novel stimulus. Throughout his documented life, no one had posed such a question. He paused, then answered, "East of Eden." Her smile widened. "Steinbeck, an excellent choice." This verbal exchange marked the onset of their attachment. After departing with the book, the visual memory of her smile persisted. His subsequent returns to the location, rationalized as searches for other titles, demonstrated a pattern of proximity-seeking behavior. The books became a functional pretext. He learned her name, Meadow, on the third visit. She displayed no curiosity about his background, allowing him to operate under the simplified identity of KL. This neutral environment facilitated the development of a rapport, free from the context of his criminal enterprise. They engaged in conversations about literature and life. Meadow disclosed her personal history, parental loss, being raised by a grandmother, and independence since age 18. She recounted these traumas with a detached composure, showing no signs of resentment. The subject perceived a sense of peace in her existence, a quality absent in his own life. The bond intensified, with the pivotal moment identified as an evening she read aloud to him exclusively, creating a powerful auditory and emotional imprint. Her voice acted as a calming agent in the quiet environment. In that moment, the subject experienced a desire for prolonged exposure to this stimulus. He continued, however, to conceal his primary identity as K.L. Thornton, a figure defined by violence and deceit. He withheld this information out of a profound fear that disclosure would transform her positive perception into one of horror, thereby destroying the only authentic connection he had formed. However, one night, while escorting her home, he detected surveillance. 3 individuals maintained a tactical, threatening distance. Vasquez's operatives, seeking a vulnerability in Cale Thornton's defenses. They had located one. His subordinate, Sterling, materialized from the alley. 3 reports from a suppressed firearm neutralized the threats. Meadow exhibited a classic freeze response, her pupils dilated, her body rigid against a brick wall. Her gaze shifted from Sterling to the weapon and then to Cale. Her expression shifted from fear to a sudden, grim comprehension as the truth of his identity became clear. She now understood his capacity for lethal violence. For 3 days, communications blackout ensued. The bookshop remained closed. His attempts at contact were ignored. For 3 days, the subject maintained surveillance on her apartment, experiencing an anxiety his rivals had never induced. The terror of abandonment became his primary motivator. On the 4th morning, she initiated contact. Her voice was quiet but resolute. "I love the man you are, Cale. Not the name, not that other life, just you." This affirmation, characteristic of a trauma bond, solidified his resolve to secure her, regardless of the cost. Cale and Meadow were married at Brooklyn City Hall. The ceremony lacked all trappings of his former status. No grand venue, no guests, no quartet, no vintage champagne. The attendees were limited to a justice of the peace and Sterling. Meadow wore a thrift shop dress and held flowers from a street vendor. The subject perceived her smile as intensely radiant. He placed a plain silver ring on her finger, a symbol of his diminished material status. To him, the moment was perfect. The consequences for this action, however, manifested swiftly. News of the union disseminated through the criminal network within 48 hours. Brantley Thornton summoned his son for a final meeting, which concluded in under 5 minutes. The patriarch, displaying an affect of cold fury, uttered only 4 words. "You are erased from the Mafia world." This expulsion was not a familial dispute, but a total nullification of his identity and power. Cale's territory was immediately reassigned. His 20-person security detail was disbanded. His financial assets were frozen. Former allies immediately severed ties. Furthermore, Raymond Hargrove, father of the spurned fiancée Priscilla, viewed the broken engagement as a grave offense, creating a secondary, independent threat. The first reprisal occurred within a week. The initial strike was psychological, not physical. Cale and Meadow were residing in a low-security, 3rd-floor apartment in Queens. They returned one evening to an unsecured door, a clear sign of a boundary breach. The message, "No father, no anything," was written in crimson paint on their bed. Meadow froze, her hands trembling uncontrollably, though she suppressed any vocal reaction. She looked at him, her voice steady, despite her lacrimal response, and recited her mantra, "We are going to be okay." They relocated that night. Cale's attempts to re-establish himself were futile. A man without a syndicate affiliation is a non-entity. Every attempted venture was systematically dismantled by his father's influence, their financial resources depleted as threats escalated. Cale accepted high-risk jobs from marginal operators, trading pieces of his psychological integrity for rent money, which precipitated his decline. Meadow observed this psychological deterioration. The man she knew was being supplanted by a silent, affectless stranger. He suffered from sleep deprivation and returned home late, bearing physical evidence of violent altercations. The subject's silence and Meadow's refusal to inquire created a tense, nonverbal dynamic. She began to grapple with the hypothesis that her entry into his life was the direct cause of his downfall, a conclusion that was clinically accurate. Without her, he would have remained a prince within his father's criminal empire. His prescribed path was an alliance with Priscilla Hargrove, securing underworld control. An unsanctioned attachment forced him into survival-level operations. He projected all responsibility for this deviation onto the female subject. This belief behaved as a parasitic thought, confirmed by Cale's physical decline and progressive emotional withdrawal. His nocturnal vocalizations reinforced her core fear. She was the architect of his perceived failure. She internalized the identity of a dead weight, the singular agent of his life's collapse. This toxic self-assessment escalated daily. That evening, she discovered Cale unconscious at a desk in their small apartment, his head resting near artifacts of their downfall. A final demand for payment, an order to vacate, a marker from a failed transaction. His right hand was a ruin of swollen, broken tissue. The day's negotiation had concluded with violence, not accord. Cale had won the physical conflict but acquired a new enemy and an additional threat. Meadow remained static, observing his sleep. In the apartment's profound quiet, his labored respiration and the clock's ticking seemed amplified. Dim light softened his features, briefly resurrecting the boy she'd met in a bookstore, a ghost from a more stable past. Yet the fresh laceration across his knuckles was stark evidence of how swiftly the former Cale was eroding. Tears tracked down Meadow's face, unheeded. She extended a hand, her palm making soft contact with his cheek. He was warm, submerged in deep sleep. She held the position for a prolonged moment, committing the sensory input to memory, aware of its finality. Her exit strategy had been developing for weeks. His world of liability and bloodshed solidified her resolve. Her attachment was so absolute it compelled her toward the one act that would fracture her psyche, granting him his freedom. Meadow retracted her hand. She took up a paper to write a final note, but found language inadequate for the action she was about to take. In the end, she inscribed a single line. "This is not the life you were meant for. Do not follow me." She placed the note on the stack of notices he would surely see. Then she collected a small bag, already containing clothes, some cash, and his gifted book. She paused at the threshold for a final observation of him sleeping. A powerful impulse urged her to return and request his forgiveness, but she knew his waking would shatter her determination. And so, she turned, slipped through the door, and vanished into the night. The following day, Cale awoke at his desk to a sharp pain in his neck. He scanned the unnervingly still apartment. Something felt dissonant. He called her name, but only the silence replied. He surged to his feet, a building dread powering his search of each vacant room. Then he saw the note. The subtext registered. She viewed herself as the pathology and her absence as the cure. Less than 3 minutes later, Cale had Sterling the line. The command was direct. Find Meadow. Use all assets. Spare no expense. The first week yielded no intelligence. 1 month passed without a single development. Cale existed as a phantom, sustained by phone calls that only brought further failure. Then, by a random occurrence, his subordinate Sterling located her in the 3rd month. He identified a weary but living Meadow in a Bronx coffee shop and decided to defy his superior. For Cale, she had effectively ceased to exist, erased from his reality. He finally terminated the search not from acceptance, but because the escalating grief threatened to consume him. He made one call to his father. Brantley Thornton listened and issued a single directive. Return home. So Cale went back, acquiescing to all his father's terms. His engagement to Priscilla Hargrove was reactivated. The alliance of the two families was cemented. Within 1 year, he had developed the Thornton empire into a behemoth, far larger and more brutal than his father had ever conceived. He became an apparition discussed in low tones along the East Coast, systematic, precise, and utterly lethal. But concealed in a desk drawer was a small velvet box holding the cheap silver ring he had once put on Meadow's finger. It was the sole artifact from that past existence he could not discard. Priscilla Hargrove, however, was anything but naive. Raised with Raymond Hargrove, family dinners were studies in silent conflict. She learned to diagnose a man's weaknesses before she could read a novel, and tonight Cale was completely exposed. In the past 30 minutes since returning from the hallway, the fractures in his composure were apparent. The smile was a well-honed mask, but his gaze was fragmented. His vocal tone was steady, but his breathing was arrhythmic. His knuckles were white on his glass as he stared at the staff door. He appeared like a puppet with its strings pulled to their tensile limit. She also observed the brief, tense exchange between Cale and Sterling. It was swift, but Sterling's expression signaled urgent damage control. She was ignorant of the cause, but she could diagnose a problem, and Priscilla Hargrove never allowed a problem to fester. She excused herself, navigated to the staff entrance, and observed through a gap in the door. Amid the frenetic motion of the personnel, one figure arrested her gaze. A young woman in a waitress uniform with neatly plaited hair was carrying a tray. She was in a clear state of advanced pregnancy. Priscilla's expression turned to ice. She had never seen Meadow, but she understood Cale's psychology. A pregnant waitress at his engagement function, capable of unsettling him so profoundly. This was an intentional act. Priscilla did not make inquiries or create a scene. As the heir to the Southern mob, her methods were precise and silent. She took out her phone and summoned the hotel manager to a private space. A man in a gray suit approached, his anxiety evident. "One of your wait staff is pregnant," Priscilla stated, her tone smooth but its implication as sharp as a scalpel. "At a high-security function like this, she is a liability. Remove her, now." The manager offered a compliant nod, a piece on her chessboard. While Priscilla orchestrated events remotely, Meadow endured a psychological blow. Her shift began with a visceral shock, a sign announcing the engagement of Cale Thornton and Priscilla Hargrove. At that instant, the life she had carefully constructed collapsed. A raw urge to flee took over, but the $120 for this shift was a significant part of her next ultrasound payment. She was quite literally too impoverished to escape her own catastrophe. So she lowered her head and served the party from hell. Meadow concentrated on dirty glassware and clearing tables. Any task but the main dais. But for one fatal second, her eyes went to a doorway and located him. Cale, the nucleus of this entire universe, the perfect archetype of a syndicate boss in his tuxedo, his face etched with hard lines. The nation's top 1% orbited him like a monarch. This was not the man from their tiny apartment broken by final notices. This version of Cale was a titan, a force of nature. He was exactly the person he was always meant to become. Analogically, Meadow smiled. The expression was momentary, a mix of grief and validation. "You made it," she whispered, a quiet confirmation for herself and the child. She turned away quickly before he could see her, vanishing once more into the faceless service ranks. Then, 15 minutes later, the manager appeared at her side. "Miss Sinclair, your shift is complete," he said, his voice cold. "Policy deems pregnant employees a risk at high-profile events." Meadow regarded him. "My schedule is until midnight. This directive is from above. Please retrieve your items and depart." "What of my payment for tonight?" The manager suddenly seemed fascinated by the carpet. "It is under review." The unspoken denial was absolute. Meadow understood the power structure. People of her status do not protest. She simply removed her apron and folded it. She collected her small bag from a locker, where 2 security men were now posted by the back exit. They escorted her out less like a worker and more like a threat. A woman 8 months pregnant after a 3-hour shift. The heavy door slammed shut, finalizing her removal. Meadow was on the pavement, the New York City night air sharp on her skin. A draft cut through her light jacket. One hand moved to her belly protectively, her purse on her shoulder. The street was deserted, cast in the jaundiced light of the lamps. She looked up at the black sky, inhaled, and began to walk, utterly alone, as she had been through the most difficult trial of her life. Meanwhile, Cale held out for precisely 15 minutes after ordering Sterling to watch the staff entrance. For 15 minutes, he maintained the facade, greeting guests while his mind was in flames. Then, he broke. He abandoned his glass, gave Priscilla a pretext about a security matter with Sterling, and walked directly to the service corridor. Priscilla registered his exit. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes narrowed fractionally. She knew. Cale forced the service door open. The staff were a whirlwind of motion within. He scanned the area once, then twice. Meadow was not visible. He stopped a waiter mid-motion. The waitress, pregnant, with brown hair, tell me her location. The server, recognizing the authority in his voice, lowered his own to a conspiratorial whisper. They discharged her, sir, about 20 minutes ago. A muscle in Cale's jaw twitched. Who issued the order? The man's terrified gaze at his own feet was the only answer required. Cale did not need to ask again. He pivoted, his gaze a burning line through the doorway to where a smiling Priscilla waited. As if sensing his stare, Priscilla turned her head to meet his eyes. Her smile remained, but her gaze issued a cold challenge, a silent message. I know who you were searching for, and she has been dealt with. The intent was clear. Cale turned to Sterling, who was standing by. A name was not needed. Sterling, aware of the singular target, glanced at his device. The data came back instantly, sterile. Bus stop, rear of the building, approximately 100 meters. Without a word, Cale moved, a projectile of pure will, bursting through the fire escape into the absorbing darkness. He was struck by the concussive cold of Manhattan's October air. His breath materialized in the sallow streetlight. The alley, empty of people, smelled of urban decay and buzzed with a low city drone. The only cadence was the sharp crack of his own footsteps on the wet pavement. Rounding the corner, the concept materialized. Meadow was a study in vulnerability, inadequately shielded from the elements. Her hands protected her gravid abdomen, her gaze fixed downwards in a state of exhaustion. He halted his approach at 5 paces. His cardiac rate escalated, a palpable force across the intervening space. An 8-month temporal void collapsed into one visceral image, a phantom made tangible, 100 meters from his victory. The auditory stimulus of his approach caused her to look up. Recognition manifested as rapid pupillary dilation. A primal protective instinct prompted her to stand, hand shielding her abdomen as she retreated. His name was a disbelieving exhalation. Stress had sharpened her features, but her eyes held the same disarming quality from the Brooklyn bookstore. His focus then shifted compulsively downward to the curve of her abdomen, registering an undeniable biological reality. A spasm of tension tightened his jaw. The subsequent silence was a tangible barrier constructed from 8 months of unspoken questions. When Cale finally vocalized, his tone was a controlled tremor weighted by his protracted search. Who is the father? Her gaze averted his, seeking refuge on the street, in headlights, anywhere but his intense focus. She had mentally rehearsed this confrontation. The pre-scripted denial was ready on her tongue. Not you. The falsehood was a brief victory of conscious will over autonomic fear. Yet her body betrayed the deception, a reflexive clutch at her child that Cale instantly decoded. His survival was predicated on reading such tells, and Meadows' deceit was transparent. Her averted gaze, the blanching of her knuckles, her sharp inhalation, every signal pointed to falsehood. He logged the lie, allowing it to remain. Then a sharp, visceral pain caused an audible gasp as her body presented its own evidence. Her mask of composure fractured, exposing a flash of pure distress that Cale registered. His assessment broadened, processing the full data of her condition. Worn footwear, thin coat, chapped hands, and the stark geometry of her pregnancy. She still wore the uniform, a remnant of a truncated existence. The calculus of her situation was clear. Terminally pregnant, exposed at 11 p.m., unemployed and unpaid. His rage sublimated, replaced by a possessive instinct. His tone softened. "Get in the car." Meadows' stare was a singular act of defiance. "I can manage without you." He rephrased the directive. "This isn't an offer. It is a requirement. Get in the car." The will to protest her 8 months of isolation succumbed to biology. Another contraction, a tremor, and exhaustion. Her resistance was eroded by fatigue. She acquiesced with a small, defeated nod, entering the vehicle. The door's closure sealed them inside as the sedan moved into the night. The silence within the car became dense and oppressive. Meadow maintained maximum distance in the seat, an arm securing her abdomen as she observed the view outside. The city lights became a smear of stimulus, perceived but not processed. Cale was positioned less than 2 feet away, yet the psychological distance between them was vast. He observed her indirectly, studying her spectral reflection in the glass. He noted every flinch, the rhythmic pressure of her hand on her belly, a defensive posture she maintained in the vehicle's warmth. Sterling, at the wheel, exemplified professional detachment, his focus entirely on driving. He understood his employer's unvoiced protocols. The heavy silence was finally broken by Meadows' quiet directive. 472 Willis Avenue, the Bronx. Sterling's eyes met Cale's in the rearview mirror. The address was self-explanatory. Willis Avenue signified a high-distress area of the borough. It was a destination of last resort, particularly for a woman in her condition. Cale, however, remained impassive. He inquired neither about her life nor the apparent danger. His sole reaction was a tightening of the jaw, a tension visible as his reflection seemed to darken. The profound silence resumed. Bridge lights passed over them as white stripes in the gloom. Meadow struggled against encroaching exhaustion, a battle her body would not allow her to win. The cumulative stress of her condition, a long shift, termination trauma, and the shock of his presence proved overwhelming. Her eyelids grew heavy, her head beginning to slump. Her respiration stabilized as she lost consciousness. Only then did Cale engage in direct observation, without the filter of the window. He studied Meadow in her defenseless state of sleep, one hand guarding her child, the other resting at her side. While sleep temporarily smoothed the lines of immediate stress, the history of the past 8 months was etched on her features. The markers of her struggle were clear, the hollows of her eyes, her lean face, and work-roughened hands, a profound departure from her previous state. The thought manifested, not as a question, but as an incontrovertible conclusion. His child. As he observed her, a minute fissure appeared in his formidable emotional barricade. Leaning forward, he issued a quiet command intended only for Sterling. "Home!" Sterling's nod was a silent affirmation. The vehicle altered its trajectory, leaving the Bronx for the insulated affluence of Upper Manhattan. 30 minutes later, the sedan paused before the formidable iron gates of the Thornton estate. The gates opened as if anticipating their arrival, their movement silent. They proceeded up a long, stone-paved drive, flanked by old oaks and illuminated grounds. At its terminus stood the mansion, a massive edifice of white stone and glass, its 3 levels fully lit. The sedan halted. Sterling opened her door. Cale's light touch on her shoulder roused her from sleep. Confusion transitioned to shock as she processed the visual data outside. This was not Willis Avenue's urban blight, but an image from a luxury periodical. Her head turned toward Cale, a protest dying before it was voiced. The sheer weight of her exhaustion prevented speech. His tone was placid but absolute, precluding any debate. "Come on, you need sleep." He guided her into a foyer that dwarfed her apartment into a ground-floor guest suite. Staff materialized, providing clean garments, warm towels, and sustenance. Meadow moved through these actions as if in a trance. The contrast was stark. 8 months prior, she fled a small flat with nothing. Now she was inside the fortress of a powerful man, concealing his progeny. The urge to speak, to explain or confess, was present, but inert. The moment her head touched the mattress, her consciousness extinguished in a total shutdown. After midnight, a deep quiet, one absent for a long time, descended upon the Thornton estate. The household staff had integrated back into the estate's framework. The ambient soundscape was reduced to the metronomic beat of a hall clock and the wind against the glass. High above, in a vast study, Cale sat in isolation, facing a glass wall that framed the silent Manhattan panorama. A large black oak desk dominated the room, its surface an organized field of legal papers and communication systems. Adjacent shelves held a curated library, trophies of corporate victories and philanthropic awards, artifacts of his meticulously constructed public persona. Cale's focus, however, was directed toward the desk's bottom right drawer. For months, it had been a sealed vault of memory he dared not access. Tonight, his discipline failed. With a slow, seemingly predetermined motion, he opened it, revealing a small velvet box. He lifted the box and its lid. Inside was a simple silver band, devoid of any stone. It represented the total of his net worth at a time when he possessed nothing else. This was the ring he placed on Meadows' finger during a quiet service at Brooklyn City Hall. The ring, an object of negligible mass, carried the profound weight of memory, the subtle tremor of her hand as he presented it. Beside its case lay a faded photograph from outside a Brooklyn bookshop where Meadows' genuine delight was apparent as she leaned into him. The photograph showed a past version of Cale, one capable of a genuine smile, a facial expression his current muscles had unlearned. He set the image down and stared at the ceiling. In the past 12 months, he had rebuilt an empire, doubling his father's Thornton enterprise. Wealth accumulated in a constant flow. His influence extended from New York to Miami. Allies solicited his favor. Adversaries were eliminated. By any objective standard, his victory was total. Yet in the silence, holding a simple ring, Cale confronted the truth. The void she left was absolute. Neither influence nor wealth, nor even the subject Priscilla could resolve the psychic void. Nothing would suffice. Placing the ring aside, he summoned Sterling. 120 seconds passed before a muted knock. "Enter." Sterling appeared, securing the door, his posture rigid and his expression a controlled mask, betrayed solely by the acute perception in his gaze. It was the countenance of an agent aware that a critical event was imminent. Cale bypassed all social ceremony, offering no amenities, moving to the core issue. The duration. Sterling required no preamble. He comprehended. Commencing the 3rd month following her absence. An audible clench from Cale's jaw was noted. 5 months. For a period of 5 months, Sterling had possessed and withheld information on Meadows' whereabouts. "Provide your rationale." Sterling's regard met Cale's, absent any trace of apprehension. because your psychological state was stabilizing. You had reintegrated with the family unit. The enterprise was expanding. The alliance with Priscilla was advancing. All components were correctly aligned. He paused. Disclosing the information would have precipitated a regression, causing you to discard it all again. And this time, a full recovery was not guaranteed. Cale's hand constricted on the desk, his knuckles losing all color. The impulse was to demolish the furniture, to seize the man who had been his adjunct for 12 years and berate him for this violation of his agency. But he remained static, for the acute distress stemmed not from the deception, but from its cold, rational basis. He despised the logic, yet he could not fault it. "Is there anything further?" Cale's voice was a low-frequency growl. Sterling's composure finally broke. "I was aware of pregnancy for approximately 5 months." The ambient temperature of the room seemed to plummet. Cale's eyes became lethal, a storm front preceding a strike. "You knew she was gravid, and you maintained your silence." Sterling did not yield his position. "I lacked certainty regarding your paternity." But the suspicion existed. This was a charge, not a question. The subsequent silence was its own confirmation, an admission Cale processed instantly. He rose from his chair with a slow deliberation that made the furniture protest. The two men stood in opposition. For 12 years. For 12 years, Sterling had served as his most crucial instrument, the single point of stability in his life. The only individual Cale had ever afforded his absolute trust in a world where such a thing was a terminal vulnerability. "Remove yourself from my line of sight, but keep her under continuous total surveillance. If she or the child incur harm due to another one of your failures, your 12 years of service will not insulate you from my retribution. Go." Sterling offered a single sharp nod, his face ashen, but his expression firm. He turned and strode into the hall, and for the first time in over a decade, the closing door did not sequester an ally, but a debtor whose sole collateral for repayment was Meadow's life. He remained in the study, his gaze fixed upon the silver ring. At last he took it, placing it in the interior pocket of his jacket before moving into the corridor. Some vestigial instinct compelled him toward the ground floor room where Meadow was sleeping. He opened the door silently and entered. The room was dark, with illumination only from the muted glow of a single lamp. Meadow slept on her side, one hand beneath her head, the other placed in a protective gesture across her abdomen. Her breathing was even, an image of serenity Cale had not witnessed in the chaotic months prior to her disappearance. He stood over her, a motionless sentinel. A sudden movement stirred beneath the blanket. A small, internal kick caused the fabric to jump. Air caught in Cale's throat. He sat on the bed's edge without a sound. He reached out, a slight tremor in his hand, and laid his palm on her stomach. The infant kicked once more, directly into his hand, a stronger, more definite sensation, as if acknowledging his presence. Cale kept his hand in place, his breathing suspended, sensing the developing life beneath her skin. His daughter. He required no confirmation, no test. An intuitive certainty that defied all logic flooded his system. This was his offspring. Meadow stirred but remained asleep. Cale withdrew his hand, stood, and proceeded to the door. Before exiting into the hall, he observed her one last time. In the absolute quiet, a resolution formed within him, as hard and immutable as forged metal. He would not permit her loss a second time. Meadow transitioned to consciousness as the first morning light penetrated the drapes. She lay motionless, her eyes scanning the high ceiling as she attempted to orient herself to the new surroundings. The bed was exceptionally soft. The room was vast. The air was crisp, lacking the familiar urban dampness of her Bronx apartment. Then the turmoil of the previous night returned with jarring clarity. She was at the Thornton estate, inside Cale's residence. She rose with care, a hand supporting the new weight of her frame, and noticed soft clothing arranged on a table. After changing and washing her face in the ensuite bathroom, she emerged to find an attendant waiting with a tray. On it were fresh fruit, toast, eggs, juice, and warm milk. Meadows simply regarded the meal, her throat constricting. For months, her breakfast had been dry bread and tap water. She ate deliberately, each bite accompanied by a sharp, inappropriate sense of shame. She had just set her glass down when a knock came at the door. The knock was soft but firm. She knew who it was before the door opened. Cale entered, now in a black shirt and dark trousers, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His expression was a controlled mask of neutrality, but his eyes indicated a night devoid of sleep. He placed a chair opposite her, with a small table between them. The silence in the room was a tangible pressure. He broke it, his voice stripped of all emotion, purely functional. "Last night, you stated the child is not mine." A cold sensation passed through Meadow. She kept her face impassive. "That is correct." Cale inclined his head, fixing her with a stare she remembered with dread. It was the look he employed to deconstruct a subject, to locate the single, infinitesimal flaw in a lie and expose the truth. "Sterling has had you under observation for the last 5 months. The blood drained from Meadow's face, her skin becoming cold. "He knew your location, your actions, your contacts." Cale's voice was a slow, methodical engine. "During those 5 months, you were with no one else. No other male partners, no new relationships. It was only you, your employment, and your progressing pregnancy." Meadow's hands began to tremble. She hid them under the table, her fingers twisting the fabric of her pants. Her eyes began to sting, but she suppressed the tears, maintaining the emotional defenses she had built for 8 months. Cale leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze an inescapable focus. The room felt smaller, the atmosphere thinner. "I will ask you one final time. Who is the father?" His voice became lower, heavier, each word delivered with the impact of a mallet strike. For 8 months, the knowledge had been hers alone. She endured countless nights of quiet grief, reconstructing her composure by morning. She would trace the outlines on sonograms, whispering promises to the life she carried. Leaving Kyle, she had concluded, was the only course of action. She would not be the detonation that leveled the world he was building. Yet now, held by the very eyes that had once met hers in the morning light, her entire construct dissolved. Her self-control fractured before it collapsed into ruin. Tears traced paths down her face. "Yours?" It was barely a whisper, but it impacted Cale with greater force than any physical blow he had ever received. He drew back in his chair, as if the air in the room had been displaced. A tremor started in his hands where they grasped the armrests, a somatic response he had not felt in years. These hands, perfectly steady when facing death, now trembled at the sound of her voice. A daughter. He was to have a daughter. An infant had developed for 8 months without his knowledge. 8 months of Meadow, enduring this burden alone, attending medical appointments alone, facing an uncertain future alone. A vast silence filled the space between them. Meadow dabbed at her eyes, her breathing coming in irregular gasps. "I was not aware I was pregnant when I left," she said, her voice strained with the effort. "I found out weeks later. You were already back with your family. The empire was secure. I read about you and Priscilla, powerful, victorious. You possessed the life you were always meant to lead." A pained swallow. "I could not subject you to my situation." Her words registered within Cale, each one a blade twisting in his gut. The agony was not in her rationale, but in the certainty with which she believed it. She was convinced that vanishing, concealing his daughter, and suffering alone for 8 months was a form of kindness. Her misguided act of self-sacrifice was more wounding than any perfidy. "You denied me that decision," he said, his voice taut with suppressed fury. "You chose to leave. You chose to hide our child. You chose for me not to know." Meadow's head fell, tears falling onto her abdomen. "I was so afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That you would hate me." Her confession was like a pressure release. The rage evacuated his chest. In that instant, he saw her, truly perceived her, with the tears and protective hand. And the anger dissipated. A worse, more corrosive anguish took its place. Then the baby kicked. It was a distinct, unmistakable kick. Meadow gasped, her hand moving to the spot. Cale watched the small movement beneath the fabric. His daughter, real, alive, a living being. He stood, crossed to the bed, and sat beside her, near enough to sense her warmth. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of anger, containing only a deep, unshakable resolve. "You will not face this alone any longer." Later that day, Cale escorted Meadow to the garden at the rear of the house, a sprawling, perfect lawn enclosed by high hedges, a marble fountain murmuring at its center. A residual warmth from the October sun countered the last remnants of the night's chill. A light wind passed through the oaks, scattering a few yellow leaves across the grass. They sat on a stone bench near the fountain, letting the sound of water fill the quiet. But this was not a strained silence. It was not the anxious, probing quiet from the bus stop, laden with falsehoods. It was not the morning silence, fractured by truth and pain. This was the calm between two people whose connection had once been total. They shared a mutual quiet where the space between them no longer needed words. For the first time in 8 months, no barrier obstructed the way between them. No lies, no secrets. Just Cale, Meadow, and the new life she carried. She observed the garden, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of those months begin to lift. Wordlessly, the female subject guided Cale's palm to her abdomen. He remained passive, compliant with her gesture. Through the fabric, a somatic transfer of warmth occurred, followed by perceptible fetal movement against his hand. This sanctioned contact sharply contrasts with his previous covert actions, which were marked by feelings of transgression. The gesture functioned as an unambiguous invitation, granting him entry into an emotional space she had guarded for 8 months. Cale's physiological response was one of shock. Widened eyes, parted lips, but an inability to vocalize. The same hand that sanctioned violence now rested on the object of his attachment. A stronger fetal movement followed, which Cale interpreted as direct communication. He displayed physiological distress, swallowing with visible lacrimation. Maintaining eye contact, he exposed his emotional vulnerability. Observing this, Meadow displayed a genuine smile, the first authentic positive affect he had witnessed since her return. The expression lacked duress, a warm effect that triggered a positive memory association for him. "She is quite active," Meadow vocalized softly. Cale's response was hoarse. "A maternal trait." This elicited a spontaneous laugh from Meadow, blending with the ambient soundscape. For a brief interval, a state of tranquility manifested within the Thornton estate's garden. The trauma of the preceding 8 months temporarily receded. However, homeostasis is an unstable state in Cale Thornton's environment, with a significant threat already developing. Priscilla Hargrove possessed prior intelligence regarding Meadows' presence. Information came from a Hargrove asset embedded within the security team after the betrothal was reinstated. A concise digital communication at dawn provided a full situational report. Subject Thornton is on site with a gravid female. Location, ground floor reception. Upon receipt, Priscilla immediately contacted her father. Raymond Hargrove processed her report, then utilized a calculated silence after she articulated the conflict. His vocal tone displayed a pathological lack of affect, as if discussing a trivial matter. Her identity? Meadow Sinclair, Cale's former partner. She is pregnant. The fetus was irrelevant to Raymond. The crisis was Cale Thornton's destabilizing action on the night of his formal engagement. Raymond immediately projected the potential outcomes. A failed engagement would dissolve the Thornton-Hargrove pact. Decades of established agreements would be nullified, creating a power vacuum that rival factions would exploit. Inter-family warfare would become inevitable, resulting in casualties. The primary driver was organizational survival, not his daughter's emotional state. "I will manage the situation," Raymond declared before terminating the call. Cale had a mandatory meeting where non-attendance would arouse lethal suspicion. Per protocol, Sterling was his escort. To ensure Meadows' security, Cale ordered a site-wide lockdown, unaware of compromised personnel within his detail. 30 minutes post-departure, a second vehicle approached the primary entrance. 2 male operatives emerged, their appearance immaculate and non-threatening. They displayed no overt weaponry that would trigger an alert. Their presentation mimicked corporate professionals, facilitating easy access, particularly with internal clearance already granted. Meadows' attempt at focusing on a text was interrupted by a staff announcement of visitors. Upon entering the hall, she observed 2 men in the foyer. The primary operative offered a brief nod and a smile devoid of genuine affect. "Miss Sinclair." Their presence was a direct communication from Raymond Hargrove, framed as a brief consultation. Meadow experienced a sudden physiological stress response. His identity was known to her only as a source of anxiety. Priscilla's father, the syndicate head, Cale must placate. "This seems inadvisable," she articulated, though the man's insincere expression remained fixed. "Mr. Hargrove is considerate of your time. This will be brief. The vehicle is ready." Meadows' gaze shifted between the operatives and a nearby guard. The guard, her designated protector, exhibited complete non-reactivity. She correctly assessed the situation as a directive, not a request. Refusal was not a viable option. While escape behaviors were considered, her advanced pregnancy and compromised security rendered them futile. The operative's demeanor was superficially courteous, but their expressions were implacable. Meadow actively suppressed a rising panic response. She complied, retrieving her coat and entering the vehicle. The car departed the estate, moving through Upper Manhattan toward Midtown. Positioned between the 2 men, she registered a somatic weight from her fetus. The environment became oppressive, inducing a profound, visceral fear. She lacked information on their destination, Raymond's objective, or her potential return. A gentle fetal movement under her hand then triggered a memory recall. Her mind returned to the garden and the reassuring, secure pressure of Cale's palm. She recalled the unguarded wonder in his expression at the fetal movement and the vulnerability in his tone as he noted, "A maternal trait." Meadow regulated her breathing, using tactile contact with her abdomen for psychological reinforcement. The vehicle halted before a nondescript midtown building with a single imposing door. A casual observer might misidentify the building as a professional office or private club. This assessment is partially correct, though its members resolve disputes extra-legally. She was escorted internally through a dim corridor, past a vacant bar with residual scents of tobacco and leather, to a rear chamber. The destination room was a confined space, more constricted than anticipated. Minimal furnishings and a single light source contended with shadows from drawn curtains. Raymond Hargrove occupied the dominant position behind the desk. At 62, his appearance was severe. Silver hair, stark features, and eyes conveying cold resolve. His attire, a gray three-piece suit minus the tie, projected the image of a corporate executive, not a crime boss. He maintained a seated, authoritative posture. His gaze was a cold, clinical assessment, methodically scanning her form and stripping away her defenses. His visual scan noted her pallor, gravid state, worn footwear, and the protective gesture over her abdomen. He indicated the vacant chair. "Be seated, Miss Sinclair." Meadows' compliance was driven not by deference, but by physiological instability. Raymond observed her briefly, his vocalization sharp and devoid of warmth. His tone was transactional, that of a man finalizing terms. "My issue is not with you personally, Miss Sinclair. You are merely an individual who formed an inopportune attachment." Meadow remained non-responsive. "However," Raymond stated, "you represent a significant complication, the gravity of which you likely underestimate." He leaned forward, adopting an assertive posture. "This alliance between my daughter and Cale is not based on affection. It is a strategic merger concerning territory, control, and revenue. This marriage is a mechanism for stability. Its failure would result in a power vacuum. And such vacuums, Miss Sinclair, are invariably filled with blood." He uttered the word with clinical detachment. "To nullify this contract is to initiate open warfare with quantifiable human loss. The casualties will not be minimal. We anticipate scores of them." Meadow exhibited an involuntary exhalation. Her protective grip on her abdomen intensified. Raymond observed this reaction before producing a thick envelope. $200,000 in currency. He propelled it toward her. "Relocate to California, Texas, or Europe. The choice is yours." He relaxed, his posture conveying absolute confidence. "The terms are straightforward. You depart New York this evening. You are to be permanently excised from Cale Thornton's life." Silence permeated the room. Meadow regarded the envelope, a sum of money that exceeded her cognitive framework for wealth. The offer represented a luxurious confinement. It promised a new identity, security for her child, and escape from menial labor during gestation. Her focus moved from the currency to Raymond, and then to her own physical form. A defiant impulse, born of sustained trauma, began to solidify into resolve. Empowered by this emergent resolve, she rose. Meadow moved her chair, standing with the deliberate slowness of her condition, her gaze fixed on Raymond Hargrove. "I have maintained my own survival for 8 months, Mr. Hargrove." Her vocal tone was stable, devoid of the tremors that had recently afflicted her. "During gestation, I performed manual labor and secured my dwelling with makeshift barriers for a sense of security. Your financial incentive is unnecessary for my continued existence. I have already demonstrated survivorship." A micro-expression flickered across Raymond's brow, a brief compromise in his stoic facade. He is a subject unaccustomed to noncompliance, particularly from a slender 27-year-old woman of low socioeconomic status. Meadow continued with a firm tone. Furthermore, my daughter is not a commodity to be acquired for $200,000. Her emphasis on my daughter served as a statement of ownership. Raymond remained a passive observer. He displayed no overt emotional response. His expression was that of an individual whose 62 years of experience correlate defiance with negative outcomes. "You possess significant fortitude, Miss Sinclair," he observed, his tone neutral. "But fortitude is an inadequate defense." This was not a threat, but a clinical prognosis. A somatic fear response traveled Meadows' spine, yet she maintained her oppositional posture. "I require transport back to my residence." After a final assessment, Raymond issued a slow, measured nod. "Return her." His operatives complied, and Meadow exited, maintaining a rigid posture until she was no longer observable. Post-confrontation, somatic tremors manifested in her hands. Alone, Raymond fixated on the refused currency. His rejection registered as a hardening of his demeanor. The conflict had escalated unpredictably. The vehicle did not return her to the designated safe location. The transport stopped on a corner 4 blocks distant in a dormant suburb. The operator offered a perfunctory smile. "Your journey concludes here, Miss Sinclair." The subtext was clear. The vehicle's involvement was deniable. The operation was clinically executed. This maneuver was characteristic of Raymond Hargrove's methods. Meadow exited onto the pavement, the vehicle door secured, and the sedan integrated back into traffic flow. The ambient temperature dropped, a sharp wind piercing her outerwear. A distance of 4 blocks, typically a walk of 7 to 8 minutes. At 8 months gestation, her physical state was compromised. Each step presented a significant challenge. She traversed half the distance before the initial, violent uterine contraction occurred. The sensation was of an extreme clamping pressure, a torsional force on her uterus. Meadow ceased movement, exhibiting dyspnea, while seizing a railing for support. She initially rationalized the event as a stress-induced symptom that would subside. Releasing the support, she attempted to proceed. After 10 paces, a second, more severe contraction began. The pain induced a flexed posture, with her arms protectively cradling her abdomen. She reported a thermal puncture sensation radiating from her core to her spine. She was observed clinging to a lamppost, hyperventilating with cold diaphoresis. She then experienced a sudden, warm, amniotic fluid release. The rupture of membranes precipitated a massive anxiety spike after 9 months of suppressed fear. The onset of parturition was undeniable. In a cold, nocturnal urban environment, her labor commenced. She attempted to use her mobile device to locate a medical facility. Palmar hyperhidrosis impeded the screen's function. Another contraction, with its acute intensity, caused her to drop the device. Meadow collapsed, assuming a supported position against the lamppost while instinctively shielding her abdomen. Respiration was labored between intense contractions. Observation of the street revealed passerby exhibiting the bystander effect. She received no assistance. The subject was isolated with her pain as parturition progressed in a hostile setting. However, she was under surveillance. 3 vehicles behind, Operative Sterling monitored the event. He identified Raymond's personnel not from files, but from direct operational knowledge. Threat assessment is a primary function of his role. With Cale occupied, direct intervention was precluded. He delegated a subordinate to maintain remote surveillance. The subject's transport was tracked discreetly. Sterling was aware their destination was the Midtown Club. He logged her presence inside for 40 minutes. He observed her exit, noting a confident posture contradicted by severe tremors. The vehicle's abandonment of her was assessed as a predictable tactical move. A real-time report then stated, "Subject is grounded. Pavement condition appears critical." visible fluid on the pavement. Sterling contacted Cale within 3 seconds. Cale was finalizing a multi-million-dollar transaction in a corporate setting. He recognized the caller's ID and accepted. The message was concise. Meadow, parturition initiated, 84th and Madison. Before the report concluded, Cale was mobile, displacing furniture in his haste. He offered no parting remarks or explanations. He exited the premises with extreme urgency, entering a waiting vehicle. The directive was issued. 84th and Madison, proceed. The car accelerated rapidly. En route, Cale engaged in a behavior inconsistent with his psychological profile. Petitionary ideation. The frantic, repeated thought focused on the subject's and infant's safety. After 7 minutes, the vehicle halted abruptly. Cale exited pre-engine shutdown and visually acquired the subject. He observed her collapsed against a lamppost, exhibiting extreme pallor. Diaphoresis matted her hair as she clutched her abdomen, gasping for air. He approached rapidly, kneeling before her. Meadow. Her eyes, clouded by pain, focused on him. She vocalized her fear. I'm so scared. Cale executed a carry, one arm supporting her back, the other her knees. Her unexpectedly low body mass registered as a negative stimulus for him. She grasped his clothing as another contraction elicited a vocalized pain response near his head. I have you, he stated, his tone controlled despite internal distress. You are secure, he repeated, placing her in the vehicle. The transport proceeded to a medical facility as contractions increased in frequency and intensity. During each pain event, Meadow applied extreme pressure to his hand. For the first time, a tremor was observed in the principal's hand, a stress response not for himself. The vehicle arrived at the Mount Sinai emergency entrance with audible deceleration. Cale retrieved Meadow from the car before assistance arrived. She maintained a firm grip on him. Her pallor and diaphoresis, pronounced as contractions, became continuous. Medical personnel approached with a gurney. He transferred her to it, her grip on him remaining. A nonverbal exchange occurred, a plea not to be left, and his assurance of presence. They moved her through sterile corridors to the maternity ward. A physician's expression confirmed Cale's unstated fears. The labor was determined to be in an advanced stage. Birth was imminent and post-term. Meadow was taken to a delivery suite, a sterile environment with active biometric monitoring. Staff operated with clinical efficiency. The physician assumed his position as Cale remained at her side. The subsequent contraction elicited a visceral vocalization of extreme pain, qualitatively different from previous expressions. Her body hyperextended, her facial features contorted, and lacrimation was observed. I cannot, she vocalized, her voice fractured. Cale moved closer to her. His vocal tone, typically used for command and intimidation, modulated to an uncharacteristic softness. You exhibit more resilience than any individual I have known, Meadow. You endured 8 months in isolation. You confronted Raymond Hargrove. Your courage is unparalleled. You will see this through. Do you understand? You will. Through her tears, Meadow established eye contact. Within the clinical environment, his presence became her psychological anchor. The physician interjected. With the next contraction, I require you to push. Exert maximum force. Meadow acknowledged with a nod, her hand pressure intensifying. The contraction began. She performed the Valsalva maneuver repeatedly. Her torso arched and neck muscles tensed. Cale provided physical and visual support, verbally encouraging her to continue. The head is crowning, the physician announced. Meadow initiated a final push against extreme somatic pain. The pressure on Cale's hand was immense, yet his expression remained neutral. One final time. Now. She inhaled, fixed her gaze on Cale, and pushed. A neonatal cry then permeated the room. The vocalization was piercing and vital, instantly dissipating the ambient tension. It was the infant's first assertion of life. Meadow collapsed back, exhausted, exhibiting rapid breathing and profuse tears. "The infant is female," the doctor announced, "and viable." A nurse performed initial infant care, swaddled the child, and placed her in Meadow's arms. The subject observed the neonate's wrinkled, ruddy features. The infant's eyes were shut, mouth agape, fists clenched. Meadow's tears continued to fall, marking the swaddling cloth. "She is perfect," Meadow articulated, her tone reflecting both exhaustion and a profound, rediscovered joy. Cale observed the dyad from a short distance. His experiential history included extremes, but this event was phenomenologically unique. The infant's eyelids then began to flutter. The infant's vision was unfocused. Iris's the typical slate gray of a neonate. Yet her gaze appeared to fix on him. A small hand extended, and her digits encircled Cale's index finger. This digit, instrumental in acts of violence and power, now exhibited a distinct tremor. The tremor continued, instigated by an infant weighing less than 3 kilograms. This tactile connection exerted more influence than any power he had previously wielded. Lacrimation occurred in Cale's eyes. He made no attempt to suppress the emotional display as tears fell freely. "Winslow," Meadow stated quietly, her voice calm despite her fatigue. "I propose the name Winslow." Cale shifted his focus from the infant to Meadow and produced a smile. The expression was genuine, devoid of its typical strategic function. It was an uncharacteristic display for his known associates. The subject, Meadow, exhibited a facial expression previously associated with a pre-trauma state, now manifested in a clinical hospital setting. The presence of the neonate, Winslow, induced a brief state of emotional tranquility. Mother, a classic response to a primary attachment figure. The male subject, Cale, displayed acute disorientation typical of a paradigm shift in identity, which was abruptly interrupted by an environmental intrusion. Cale's conditioned hypervigilance was triggered, manifesting a defensive posture. The stimulus was identified not as an external threat, but as his progenitor, Brantley Thornton. The elder subject presents as a more affectless phenotype of Cale. Mutual gaze was established, acknowledging a documented 2-year schism. Their prior interaction had culminated in a declaration of familial disownment, prompting Cale to position himself as a physical barrier before the infant. Brantley's attention, however, bypassed both his son and Meadow, fixating solely on the bassinet. Cale's physiology indicated preparation for imminent conflict. A sudden cessation of ambient sound occurred. Brantley then extended an appendage instrumentally linked to the construction of his criminal enterprise. Paradoxically, the subject's hand exhibited a fine motor tremor, incongruent with his psychopathic profile. The infant's movement coincided with this anomaly. Mutual gaze with the neonate instigated a visible internal conflict as Brantley actively suppressed a profound affective surge. He redirected his gaze to Meadow, the object of his documented contempt. Her response was non-submissive. He uttered, "She has your face." He then engaged Cale with a gaze meant to assert dominance, stating the high probability of an attack by Hargrove. Cale's affirmation indicated prior awareness. The interpersonal dynamic shifted from adversarial to strategic alignment. They became tacticians, and Brantley's command, "Then we prepare," confirmed this. The exchange lacked any conciliatory elements. However, the use of the plural pronoun we signaled a strategic realignment of allegiance. We signaled the reformation of the Thornton Syndicate. Cale's position was no longer isolated. After a final assessment, Brantley vacated the premises. Meadow exhibited a somatic release of tension, while a micro-expression of hope momentarily breached Cale's typically guarded facade. The subsequent diurnal period presented a tableau of maternal bonding, with the infant Winslow positioned on the mother's chest in idealized attachment. This observed tranquility was, however, a fragile construct. Elsewhere, subjects Raymond Hargrove and Priscilla were exhibiting extreme narcissistic rage. The betrophal's dissolution served as a formal declaration of conflict, with Meadow as the catalyst. Cale exhibited acute sleep deprivation. His nocturnal behavior consisted of sustained surveillance of the family unit. Meadow, exhibiting vocal exhaustion and resolve, initiated verbal contact. "My departure is imperative, Cale, to prevent further escalation." His response displayed profound dysphoria. "You enacted that protocol 8 months prior. Report the outcome." Her memory recalled a sustained period of threat and evasion. Cale articulated his psychological regression. "Your absence precipitated a complete devolution of my character. My instinct for self-preservation was nullified in your absence." She attempted to suppress a lacrimal response as he continued his verbal stimuli. He then produced a tactile artifact, a velvet container she believed had been eliminated. It contained a simple, thin, silver band. The ring, from a period of his social and financial exile, dismantled her emotional defenses, resulting in uncontrollable lacrimation. "You retained this artifact?" she vocalized. "Continuously," he affirmed. "Possession was never relinquished." This confirmation induced a state of hysterical crying. This emotional discharge represented the accumulated trauma of the last 8 months. Cale then initiated physical contact by taking her hand. He applied firm pressure. "Conflict is imminent, yet I elect for interpersonal strife with you over tranquility in your absence. Meadow Sinclair, resume the role of my spouse." Her gaze triangulated between the artifact, the subject, and their progeny before she gave an affirmative response. This new contract was colored by an awareness of elevated risk. He met her gaze, looked to their child, and vowed, "No terrestrial force will separate us again." Outside, morning light illuminated Manhattan. Within Mount Sinai, a fractured familial unit was undergoing reintegration. Concurrently, Raymond Hargrove's retaliatory schema was being actualized in a nocturnal venue. Priscilla's narcissistic injury manifested as rage. In contrast, Cale Thornton's cognitive focus had constricted entirely to Meadow Sinclair and their offspring, Winslow. The subject, previously adrift, had located a psychological anchor. His concept of sanctuary shifted from material wealth to the familial dyad. This case enters a new phase. In certain cases, attachment necessitates hostility against external threats. The optimal survival strategy becomes direct confrontation, not evasion. The female subject demonstrated fortitude derived from the will to endure, while the male subject's case shows that even for disordered personalities, a relational sanctuary can exist. The data suggests the ultimate psychological sanctuary is not a location, but a person who provides psychosocial equilibrium. This case study corroborates this principle. Your engagement validates a core hypothesis. The attachment drive can supersede established power structures. This analysis is for individuals who recognize attachment often necessitates conflict. Our analytical dissection of these complex relational dynamics will continue. For all engaged in such cognitive pathways, we wish you clarity. This study resumes in our next publication.